Chapter for the Senior Practicum this quarter. And it was the first year that I've done it. And fortunately, I had a lot of good advice from Mary Sprague, whose name I invoked multiple times over the course of the quarter. And I enjoyed it very much, and I had the benefit of working with two really great teams of students. And one of the interesting things that you'll see today is that although both teams had the same client, the actual nature and content of the projects was quite different. And I think it's very interesting to see exactly the diversity, because I think it suggests, you know, the span of kind of work and the span of kind of knowledge that somebody who comes from a public policy training, you know, can have and can do. So, without any further introductions, because each team is going to be introducing themselves, we'll begin. And we've got some. Bruce, and why don't you guys come sit up here?
Oh, I don't know about this.
Yeah.
You might ask me a question.
We have, and
you might ask us questions. That's a bigger problem.
I get to play good competition. Live up to your reputation, Bruce.
I'm Anjali Kumar.
I'm Philip Nazarian.
I'm Austin Locke.
I'm Amber Farrell.
And I'm Adam Khorakiwala.
So in 2004, our client, Americans for Cures, helped successfully pass Proposition 71, which raised about $3 billion for stem cell research funding in California. Now, 10 years later, that money is on the verge of running out, and thus Americans for Cures tasked us with the following question. What is the best way to raise public funds for stem cell research in California moving forward? For the past 3 months, our team has tried to answer that question as best we can, and today we present the results of our work. Our presentation is laid out in the following way. First, we give you some relevant background info. What was Proposition 71, and what did it actually do? How does the stem cell research funding process work, and what areas need to be targeted? And finally, what political changes since 2004 prove relevant today? Second, we lay out our criteria that we used for doing our analysis. These are divided into two camps, the more important critical criteria and the less important influential criteria. We then offer our recommendations for Americans for Cures. This is where we specifically propose what we think Americans for Cures should do in 2016. We then delve into our fuller analysis. We look at all the other funding contenders we considered and highlight their relative strengths and weaknesses. We show why our recommendation proves superior to these other contenders. Finally, we talk about some practical tips moving forward, what we think Americans for Cures can do to successfully implement our recommendation. So to begin, what was Proposition 71? Specifically, it did two things. It raised $3 billion for stem cell research using the funding mechanism of general obligation bonds, which is essentially debt service spread out over a number of years. It also politically insulated that money by inserting clauses into the California state constitution. On a more visible, tangible level, it established two important things. First, the establishment of CIRM, the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine. This is the centralized agency which decides who gets that $3 billion, which scientists, which labs, and so on. It also spent a good chunk of that money establishing infrastructure on UC campuses, medical labs, and the like. What important changes have happened since 2004? First, in the general realm of public opinion, there's not this sort of kind of anti-Bush sentiment that mobilized voters to the polls at the time. In 2004, President Bush had instituted a policy where federal funding was not directed towards any researcher who created new stem cell lines. And since 2010, President Obama has reversed that policy. So that same impetus and motivation to go to the polls to vote for stem cell funding in California doesn't really exist anymore. Moreover, the top issues for California voters are sort of generally disconnected from stem cell research. A recent Hoover poll in October of this year identified the top 3 concerns as being all budgetary related, and most political experts we interviewed identified the issues of infrastructure, drought, and general economic concerns as being predominant in California voters' minds. There's also been important changes to the seats of power in California. Governor Schwarzenegger is no longer in power. Governor Jerry Brown has taken his place. In the California legislature, the Senator Pro Tem and the Speaker of the Assembly recently termed out in October of this year. Those seats are now held by Kevin De Leon and Tony Atkins. And actually, 2 days ago, we learned from a client that both of those legislators are generally supportive of stem cells, future stem cell funding. Jerry Brown's stance is still unknown, but interestingly enough, his stance will probably be determined by his wife.
So in addition to detailing the institutional and the political context that surrounds stem cell funding in California, we thought it also important to break down the medical research process. So this graphic, excuse me, Anjali, is a breakdown of biomedical research spending nationally in 2011. As you can see, about 56% of funding comes from industry, 31% from government at all levels, and the remaining percent from universities and the nonprofit sector. Within the stem cell field, we suspect that the government share is higher and the industry share lower because the field is so new, and there's been more of an emphasis on basic research and translational research, and not as many cures in clinical trials as of yet. So moving on to a description of the medical research process in general, although you can make finer grained distinctions, you can most simply define research as either basic, translational, or clinical, where basic involves scientists working with chemical compounds and attempting to determine what they can do, how they work, so on and so forth. Translational is where those basic findings are translated into more specific ideas about cures for particular diseases. And then clinical, which is largely the domain of the private sector, is where you take your findings and you focus them on drug development and testing those drugs in petri dishes, on animals, and then in people for safety and efficacy. So in general, the basic research sector is dominated by the public sector and by universities, clinical research by the private sector, and unfortunately, translational research has been the domain of no one, really, in recent years, and that's why funding going towards it is much smaller. So in looking at our funding mechanisms, we're going to focus in particular on mechanisms that funnel money into translational research, where there's really quite a dearth of funds at the moment. Finally, this is just a quick breakdown of funds committed by the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine as of January 2013. This is a cumulative graph, so this represents the total amount committed as of that time. And as you can see, over the years, there's been an increasing shift from focusing funds on building research facilities and training scientists toward actually spending money on discovery, which is basic, and clinical research. And because the stem cell field is at a point where cures could come to the market within 15 to 20 years, we believe that this trend towards clinical and discovery research ought to continue, particularly the translational and clinical.
As Anjali mentioned, in approaching our analysis, we generated a list of criteria that was broken down into two parts. We began with critical criteria, and then we later on have influential criteria. We began by talking to our clients and then meeting with experts and doing individual research and determining which criteria were most important and which should be included in our analysis overall. So the critical criteria begins with funding quantity, which is pretty straightforward. This is the amount of funds that the alternative can provide, whether it be through grants, the private market, or to whoever is doing stem cell research. The second criteria is insulation from politics. This is the alternative's ability to remain insulated from appropriations or any other political process that would disrupt the continuous dispersal of funds or grants or however the funding is reaching researchers. The third criteria sounds similar but is focused specifically on economic factors and non-political factors that would disrupt the continuity of funds reaching researchers. And the final criteria is political passage. This is the alternative's political feasibility and ability to either be passed through the legislature, through an initiative, or whatever process it would take to bring this alternative into actualization. Our second list is influential criteria. And just to highlight the difference between influential and critical criteria, we felt all alternatives needed to perform at a minimum level in each critical criteria to be considered a worthwhile alternative that could actually perform and generate results. Influential criteria are all important, but if an alternative didn't meet a certain level in any of these categories, we still considered it a good alternative. It might just be not as good as one that doesn't perform as well. So we began with net cost, which is the alternative's efficiency of use with funds, so minimizing overhead, its ability to disperse as much of the funds it takes in to researchers. The second critical criteria is targeting market gaps and failures. Austin spoke about this specifically. This is targeting translational research and dispersing funds, not equivalently, but trying to target all different parts of the research process so that there isn't too much of an emphasis on basic research and the research can finally reach the market, whether it be in 10 or 15 years. The third criteria is fairness, which is broken down into two parts. The first part is placing the cost burden of the alternative on those most likely to benefit from its research, whether it's placing it on future generations at a time when these therapies reach the market, or placing it on those most likely to actually need the therapies and benefit from the use of these therapies. And our last criteria is collaboration and bridging institutions. This is the alternative's propensity to bring in non-targeted agents or researchers or funding to help aid researchers targeted directly by this alternative. Whether it's bringing in international researchers, national and non-California funding, or any of those kinds of benefits. And lastly, we're not going to go too much in depth into the specific points of this, but this gives you a view of what our overall analysis was, which we go into a lot more depth in our actual paper. But essentially, we took each alternative and analyzed it according to all of these criteria. We gave it a qualitative rating, whether it's fair, poor, good, or excellent, and we use that as a guideline for making our final recommendation.
Great. So over the past few months, we've researched and analyzed various potential funding alternatives based on the criteria that Phil just outlined. And given our analysis, we've come to the conclusion that general obligation bonds actually are the optimal funding alternative for stem cell research. And we're also going to be suggesting that this be accompanied by stem cell specific R&D tax credits. But for general obligation bonds specifically, we're recommending a similar structure to Proposition 71 in that general obligation bonds would be sold for a 10-year period and be continuously appropriated as Article 35, Section 4 of Proposition 71 details, and CIRM would continue to manage the dispersal of funds. So what we found to be one of the most promising features of general obligation bonds is that they almost certainly provide the stability and quantity of funding necessary for the creation of therapies. And the exact amount of the bond measure would be determined by the economic and political conditions at the time of passage, but we believe this amount will surpass any other alternative because this approach allows the cost burden to be distributed over a 30 to 40-year period. We're also confident that this alternative can be implemented effectively because, based on our evaluation, it's very politically stable. And the bonds would create a pool of funds that CIRM controls rather than legislative control, which insulates stem cell funding from politically driven appropriation or transfer by legislators. And again, this is outlined in Article 35 of the proposition text. So when assessed against our criteria, the GOB approach is superior to other funding alternatives.
So whereas Proposition 71 focused entirely on levying general obligation bonds in order to fund stem cell research, our proposal adds a research and development tax credit targeted towards stem cell science to give an extra incentive to the private sector to invest in bringing the very first cures to the market. So as it stands right now, the California state tax law includes an R&D tax credit for both qualified, which is in-house research, and for basic or contract research, which is where a private sector company contracts with a university or something like that in order to advance more basic research processes. So our proposal here is to raise the qualified or in-house credit rate from 15 to 20% for a 5 to 10 year period as a way of helping the private sector overcome the initial hesitance or inertia that might come with investing in a new unproven field. So because there haven't been any stem cell cures actually put on the market yet, we felt the private sector might be somewhat reticent to invest, and as a result, a heightened tax incentive could really help overcome that initial inertia. So we propose that the tax credit be passed in conjunction with general obligation bonds via ballot initiative. That was the way in which it would be most politically feasible, and according to our calculations, it would generate about $20 million per year in private sector investment, though it is very difficult to estimate exactly how much additional funding and increase in the tax credit would create. It's very dependent on state and field-specific factors. In crafting the incentive, one would have to be very careful to make sure that the costs don't get out of hand, because one could clearly imagine that if the stem cell field really explodes in the years to come, then a whole bunch of private sector companies are going to start taking advantage of this credit, and that could lead to fairly significant tax losses for the state of California. So we felt that a combination of tax credits and general obligation bonds was better than either alone, because it addresses the criterion that we looked at related to targeting market gaps. So whereas general obligation bonds focus funding on translational research and provide a long-term, large, steady source of funding, tax credits help overcome the inertia of the private sector and bring a short-term extra boost to bring those first cures to market. And then once those first cures have actually reached the market, it shouldn't be needed anymore, and we would suggest that the state of government, or the state of California let the credit expire. Additionally, from a political perspective, we felt that the combination would be more effective than either alone, because it demonstrates a certain responsiveness to the critics of the original proposition. If we were to have simply proposed another round of general obligation bonds, critics might say that this is just Proposition 71 again, without any real attempt to address the concerns of critics. And if we were to pass a tax incentive by itself, it just wouldn't raise enough funds to continue to advance the field.
Now we're going to briefly pivot from discussing the particularities of our recommendation to understanding the other alternatives we considered and see how each of them stacked up against our recommendation. The first recommendation that we will be discussing concerns the prospect of not funding stem cell research at all from the California state government. Now, in such a scenario, the National Institute of Health at the federal level would step in and be the primary source of public funds for stem cell science here in the state of California. Now, in trying to understand what that would look like in terms of the sort of quantities you'd expect from the NIH in the event that the California government would stop funding, we had to look at what has been happening and what is currently happening. Now, in 2013, the NIH gave the state of California $220 million for stem cell science. Now, considering that CIRM funds stem cell science on the order of $300 million a year, the amount that the NIH would need to increase to fill up that gap would be a 236% increase over what they today are providing to the state of California. Now, from our understanding of the realities of the NIH, we don't think that sort of increase would be anything that could be expected without certain funds. When evaluating other criteria, such as the collaborative capacity of NIH funds, we did not observe a particularly strong history of private sector collaboration between the NIH and private sector researchers. However, NIH funds do have the benefit of actually having a lower net cost. That's a result of having no debt burden that you have from the creation of general obligation bonds. The NIH gets its money from direct appropriations from the federal budget, which don't have an associated debt cost. Now, when trying to understand the funding stability that you can expect from the NIH, we looked over time to see what funding stability actually looked like over time. Now, you'll notice on the graph on the left-hand side of the screen here that NIH funding as a whole has steadily increased in the last 10 years, but this level of increase has been counterbalanced by the extent of healthcare inflation, which has actually caused a net reduction in real terms of 20% in NIH funding in the last 10 years. Now, if we look closer at the NIH stem cell funding, you might notice a notable increase in the last 10 years. However, since 2009, you'll notice that there has been even a steady decline in the total funding from the NIH. Now, given that without California state funds, you would expect or would like the NIH to come in and increase the level of funding, given that you've not experienced any growth from that field, we don't think it's actually feasible for the NIH to step in and generate more funds. Now, on the question of political insulation, the NIH over the years and stem cell funding at the federal level over the years has been susceptible to federal regulation of stem cells. As was earlier pointed out by my colleagues, the federal government has had a mixed history of regulating stem cell science research, and any changes to those sort of regulations would impact the flow of funds from the NIH. Now, moving on to another funding alternative, where the state of California would continue to fund stem cell science, but instead of a general obligation bond, they would appropriate it from the general California State Fund. Now, when trying to assess the expected quantity that you would get from that, we try to compare other states who had initiatives funding stem cell science in particular from an appropriations method. We looked in particular at the state of New York and Connecticut. And if you notice the right side column here, we took the amount that they appropriated per year for stem cell science as a fraction of the GDP, and that came out to a third of what California managed to create with general obligation bonds. That to us indicated that you can't expect the same quantities from the appropriations method, because in that method, funds and different interests compete for appropriations funds on a year-on-year basis. And that extent of competition creates an overall lower quantity of funding. Now, if we look at other factors like political insulation, the state of Connecticut and the state of New York have experienced relatively good political insulation because they have copied the exact same clause that we mentioned from Article 45 of Proposition 71 in their state laws. However, as we've come to understand, because these come from the appropriations method and not a ballot initiative, other state governments, as new elections come in, have the capacity to then alter those funds. So we are not completely politically insulated in this alternative. Now, as for the question of actually being able to pass something like an appropriations bill for stem cell science, we have noticed that each of these initiatives have required strong executive support. Now, as Anjali mentioned, we do not know the current thinking of both the governor and his wife on the issue of stem cell science and funding stem cell research at a state level, so we cannot be certain about the political passage of an appropriations method.
So the next alternative we considered was levying a sin tax that would funnel the revenue it generated directly into CIRM to be distributed as grants. So for looking at quantity, we tried to gauge how much money is currently being raised by sin taxes in California, and we used cigarettes as an example. So as it says, about $900 million were raised in 2011 in California from cigarette taxes. To raise a comparable quantity as general obligation bonds for CIRM, we would need to raise the tax rate by an estimated 33, if not larger, %. So we felt that that large magnitude increase in the tax rate is pretty unlikely, and it would be hard for California voters to stomach such a large hike in such a short period. One benefit of sin taxes, though, is we feel there's an increased fairness in using this alternative, in that the cost burden falls specifically on those more likely to develop heart disease, cancer, and other medical problems that stem cells could effectively address in the future. There's also an issue, though, of political passage, in that, as I mentioned with quantity, we don't think that it's feasible for this method if we wanted to raise a legitimate quantity to be passed, because it's such a large magnitude increase in such a short period of time. We tried to address some of these issues by combining a sin tax with tax-backed general obligation bonds. This is a model that's used in the California education system quite commonly, although the funds are generally put towards public works and real infrastructure as opposed to medical research or less tangible projects. But luckily this would help us address the quantity issue, in that we could raise the tax rate by a smaller amount, an estimated 20 or 22%, and levy that tax for 30 or 40 years instead, but raise the quantity to $300 million of dispersals for 10 years, similar to Prop 71's general obligation bonds. And it also has an increased fairness as opposed to sin taxes, in that we're putting the cost burden on future generations as well, and those likely to be able to realize the therapies when they reach market. In this case, though, we still feel that there's an issue of political passage, in that even though the magnitude of the tax rate hike is smaller, it still would probably be too large for any for California voters to support in an initiative.
Alright, so the last funding alternative that we examined was providing some sort of policy to provide matching funds for philanthropists that donate money to the the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine. We imagined a policy in which the state government could kick in 20 cents for every dollar that philanthropists donate into this fund or into stem cell science in general. We pretty quickly discounted this idea. There isn't a whole lot of precedent for it nationwide, and furthermore, the amount to be raised is not particularly high. That being said, we do suggest that Americans for Cures and CIRM continue to solicit funds from the philanthropic sector, which they've already done to a certain extent, with a good amount of success. So returning to our proposal, it stacks up extremely well on a number of our main criteria. In terms of quantity, general obligation bonds raise a significant amount of funds that can be used to really push the very first stem cell cures to the market. In terms of political passage, from our research we've found that general obligation bonds are much more likely to pass via ballot initiative than a tax increase. And furthermore, our tweak in which we're adding a tax incentive makes it appear as if the initiative is being responsive to the needs of the critics of the original proposition. In terms of stability, general obligation bonds, as we have seen over the past 7 to 8 years, provide a long-term, steady source of funding, insulated from the political process by Article 35, Section 4 of the ballot initiative. And then finally, this proposal very effectively targets the gap in translational research that we've identified. And although we wouldn't necessarily say there's a gap in clinical research, there's a lot of money going towards it. We felt that the little extra incentive on the front end for a short-term tax incentive would be beneficial in bringing the first cures to market and then creating sort of a catalytic event. No.
So now we're going to pivot from talking about our analysis and our recommendation to talking about what Americans can actually do with it moving forward. First of all, I'm going to talk about the political plan. And as many of you in the room know, Bob Klein is something of a skilled political operative. So these are really suggestions we've culled from our expert interviews that we think might be supplemental and useful for him moving forward. First, the importance of polling. It's 2 years before the 2016 election, and we simply don't know what the relevant economic and political issues will be. We've given American for Cures a very specific recommendation, and the best way to know how that plays in the public arena is to put a poll to it and see how it tests out. And any alterations can be made after that polling. The second thing we think is that 2016 is actually the ideal election to put an initiative up for vote. 2016 has two important attributes. First, it's a presidential election that will draw out a lot of what experts call Hillary voters, young and progressive voters. There's also likely to be a marijuana legalization initiative on the ballot at that time. And even if voters don't come out specifically to vote for stem cell funding, they're likely to read down the ballot, see this initiative, and be prone to vote for it because they're young and progressive. We also think that surveying the competitive landscape of the ballot will prove important. It seems like there's going to be quite a number of general obligation bond initiatives on the ballot in 2016. And it's possible that opposition might mobilize not from anyone who's really opposed to stem cell funding, but from people who want to draw attention and support away from this initiative and towards their own. We also think that Jerry Brown's support or opposition might prove important. The best case example of this is the recent Proposition 30 and Proposition 38 that were on the ballot in 2010. Both of them were virtually identical policy options. They used general obligation bonds to fund California State College education. Proposition 30, however, contained a few nuances that Jerry Brown preferred, and his support of it and his opposition of Proposition 38 effectively killed the latter. So it's important to know what he thinks of this ballot initiative and whether he would support or oppose it in any substantial way. Finally, we think that the 2016 election is still 2 years out, and that American for Cures has ample time to shape public opinion in a way that will benefit them 2 years down the road. Internally, they publicize a lot of their successes, such as the 38,000 job years they've created and the 10 therapies that are moving into clinical trials. But this information really isn't known to the larger public. And putting that information out there will help kind of give a positive view of Proposition 71 and of stem cell funding in general moving forward.
Alright, so even outside outside of ideological objections to stem cell research in general, CIRM has been facing a lot of criticism and has faced a lot of criticism in the past. Opposition to Prop 71's sees Prop 71's most glaring deficiency as its failure to produce any therapy so far, although progress has certainly been made in the field. And another prominent concern is that the state of California faces too much debt already to take on another research project like Proposition 71. Additionally, CIRM's peer review process has been criticized as being perhaps too secretive, and CIRM has argued, though, that requiring full transparency in the process could undermine the program and its effectiveness. But more specifically regarding CIRM's governance, critics, especially in the press, have pointed to conflicts of interest. Many are concerned that ultimate decisions about grants and standards for CIRM are being handled unethically because they believe there are too many conflicts of interest within the institution. And CIRM has been addressing these concerns since as early as 2005, when conflict of interest provisions were broadened and other rules were implemented, such as the requirement that research grant reviewers list any companies in which they have more than a $5,000 investment. So as of now, CIRM's policies are in line with those of other major research institutions, and we think that that fact and the conflict of interest policies could be publicized to sort of preempt future criticism on this topic.
So just as there are likely to be many criticisms of the general obligation bond aspect of our proposal, there will also likely be criticisms of the tax credit. These four are the ones that we identified as most likely to arise in the next couple of years. The first is that costs for a tax incentive are just very difficult to forecast, especially from a general equilibrium perspective. Most of the papers on R&D tax incentives focus on if a state increases its rate by a certain amount, the research spending in that state will increase by a certain amount, but it doesn't really focus on national effects. Do companies just reallocate research funding from one state to another? What are the worries about that? So that's one thing that could arise, and whoever goes about drafting this proposition, likely our client Americans for Cures, will have to be careful in the way it crafts the incentive to maximize the amount incentivized. Moreover, some might worry that their tax credit could be seen as a kickback to big pharma. That being said, we don't see it as being a really salient political criticism because the amount to be raised is not likely to be anything higher than 20 to 25 million per year. Some also might worry about a targeted tax credit leading to rent seeking or things like that, where the software industry, the agricultural industry will suddenly come to the state government and say, hey, we'd like a targeted tax incentive too. However, the fact that this tax incentive is being passed via ballot initiative and not via the state legislature seems to make that less likely. So it's not opening up a political avenue for other types of rent seeking in the future. Finally, perhaps the most concerning criticism is that accounting tricks might be used to relabel existing research as stem cell research. And while that's certainly a possibility, and while it does happen with most R&D tax incentives, if one defines stem cell research quite clearly, in drafting the bill language, those concerns can be minimized to a large extent.
All right, and finally, we've tried to provide a wide survey of the funding landscape in California, but we've listed some ways upon which our research could be expanded, and we think it would be beneficial for Americans for Cures to take several steps going forward, including conducting polling on the public appetite for further stem cell research. As I mentioned before, addressing past criticisms of CIRM by publicizing new provisions and policies. Third, publicizing the scientific outcomes of CIRM, CIRM-funded work, sometime in the near future to set the stage for a ballot initiative in 2016. And lastly, drafting language for R&D credits and assessing reactions from relevant experts. Additionally, in terms of research, it could be helpful to gauge the reactions of our proposed policy from interest groups and from Jerry Brown, and finally, further research the impact of state-level R&D credits in California. Okay, this is just an image of our completed outcomes matrix and our analysis and evaluation of all of the alternatives. Additionally, this concludes our presentation. We did want to note that we really enjoyed working on this process, and we want to thank Larry for being such a helpful and available resource at all times throughout the process. And if you have any questions now, we'd be happy to take them. Thank you.
Great, thanks for doing this. It was fantastic. So just, you mentioned the idea of NIH funding, but did you think about at all sort of why should California be funding this? And what the sort of externalities are, the free rider effects of all the other states?
Can you elaborate on what you mean by the free rider effect on other states?
The other states get the benefit of the research, right? The cures and everything else that come out of California, and they don't pay for it.
So while there are those sort of those other externality effects with the fact that they do benefit from the medical benefits, CIRM has provisions to actually benefit from the intellectual property and the medical results that come out of that research. They collect a certain amount of royalties from intellectual property. So in the long run, while the entire country and possibly the world benefits from the research, CIRM does eventually get a share of the revenues that are generated from the medical outcomes.
In addition to that as well, there was an analysis done by Larry Baker here around the time of the passage of the initial proposition, and it forecasted that the amount of job years created within the state of California, since all research funded by CIRM occurs within California, could also far outweigh the costs of the initiative itself.
Also, just to give you kind of an annoying answer to that question as well, because I don't feel like we're fully addressing the concern that you raised. Part of it is just the scope of our problem.
You guys were getting the assignment.
Yeah, and it was very narrowly. They were asking us to raise funds for California. Americans for Cures wanted to raise funds specifically for California and not on a national level. I think a part of that is like the benefits of having such a small area, like where all the research is happening, and I could like list off general, but. The real answer that we don't have like a good answer to your question is we were told that this is how Americans wanted
it. It's completely fair that you wanted it. We're addressing the client wanted, but
yeah.
That was terrific, thank you. How do you sell something like this to the public when CIRM has not had a success with its initial investments? And secondly, there have been questions about political influence over CIRM spending of the first $3 million.
So I think as to that first question, we don't really have a good answer to that. Like literally every political expert we talked to, and there's 5 to 7 of them, said the public is going to ask, what has Proposition 71 done, and why haven't we seen any results yet? We've given some, suggestions on how to publicize the information they have internally to increase the public perception of Proposition 71, but there's no firm good answer we have for Americans for Cures, and probably something they're struggling with too. And your second question again was?
Well, how do you counter the suggestion that CIRM's initial spending was politically influenced? Its operational costs were politically influenced in terms of some of the people they hired, and the deployment of some of the capital was influenced by certain members of the board in particular.
Again, another tough question. Publicizing results about transparency and so on is kind of our best answer, but do you guys have any?
You may not even have to worry. In a world in which this really went to the ballot, it's not clear who would spend money to fight it.
Right, yeah.
So it might be more editorial boards and others that would be, and nobody reads papers anymore, so you don't have to worry about it. So it's really going to come down to how much money would be behind the initiative and who would be, if anybody would be spending money to oppose it.
I think just building off of that, when speaking with our client on Tuesday, he had mentioned that a lot of the criticism came from the Sacramento Bee and its writers in particular, who were pretty much against any ballot initiative at all because they just are opposed to that form of political participation. And supposedly that newspaper has moved on a little bit from its criticism in that regard. Another researcher we spoke with also mentioned that making sure not to overpromise on round 2 and saying we just need to continue the investment that you've already made. This is the progress we've reached so far. Could help provide a more palatable political argument.
Yeah, because the truth of the matter is when CIRM began the disbursement of the funds, they had not budgeted any actual royalties or revenue coming in for another 15 years. So they did not expect to have any therapies ready at this point. So, but the narrative that was created during the ballot initiative was somewhat different to that reality.
I think so. Let me just answer one other thing about this. And how do you respond to the fact that when the first initiative went to market, it was in response to President Bush putting limits on federal research, and those limits are less effective now, right?
Yes.
So how do you make the same argument that California needs to do this when the federal government is no longer as constrained, either because I actually don't know if the federal government has removed those restrictions or they've found non-embryonic stem cells that they can use for research. But how do you address that concern? Because if I was Governor Brown, I might say, look, why are we doing this when the federal government now is in a position to do it?
So I can elaborate on the actual federal laws that are still in place. So what was initially banned was any research initiative that used new stem cell lines prior to a particular date. That law no longer exists. What still exists is that no federal funds can be used to actually produce new stem cells. So you're right in that federal funds are free to fund research that use any sort of stem cells today. But the existing reality with the NIH is that the inertia within the organization is such that they've not actually recalibrated the allocation of their funds to reflect the new regulation. What I mean by that is that the total fraction of the funds that the NIH funnels towards, say, embryonic stem cells is only slightly more than what it was before the regulations were removed. So, although they are now at liberty to fund these new research ventures that use newer stem cell lines, they by and large don't. And CIRM has traditionally and always has been able to fund it, and that is reflected in its spending allocation.
I have two more points too. So there's also the Dickey-Wicker Amendment that's still in place at a federal level. And New York instituted, I think it was entirely private money, the New York Stem Cell Initiative, that brought almost a cure to market at this point. It certainly moves much faster than any federal funding because they're able to bypass that kind of restriction. And there's also kind of the point about institutionalization, which we don't know that much about, but our client raised to us, which is that the NIH, doesn't change very quickly. And so, the way in which they fund projects and the way in which kind of things work within that institute probably hasn't changed that much in the past couple of years to be able to really be that divergent from when the Bush administration was kind of making policy.
Thank you.
If I can just say one thing, I thought the presentation was terrific. Really smooth, cool, as Abraham Lincoln said.
Any other questions? Great, thank you.
Great, thank you.